So here we are interviewing with Ian Williams, an award-winning journalist, an author and a cybersecurity expert. We've asked Ian here to talk about the next generation of tech and the impact on that of human rights. But first of all, tell me a little bit about how did you begin? 25 years ago, you came from the Sunday Times. What happened next?
From the Sunday Times, I went into television. I was initially reporting on business affairs for the Sunday Times, and then I shifted to Channel 4 News and became a foreign correspondent. I was based in Moscow for 3 years, and then after that moved to the Far East, opening Channel 4's Hong Kong bureau in the run-up to the handover to China. Stayed out there in Hong Kong, in Beijing, in Bangkok, for Channel 4 News, and then for NBC, the American network. And it was really from more recent reporting that I developed an interest in cyber issues, partly because I was hacked myself during an assignment.
What happened? That's terrible.
It was during the Olympic Games in 2008, and I returned to my hotel room, and my laptop was open on my desk, and I went online, and I noticed, looking at my particular laptop had at the time, it told you when the last backup had taken place and the disk to which that backup had happened. And I looked at it closely, and I looked at it again, and I realized that the backup had taken place when I was not there and to a disk that I didn't recognize. As it happened, a lot of what's on that computer was behind an intranet wall, because a lot of my contacts and other documentation, I was working for NBC at the time, so I would have to go into their system to get at that. And there wasn't any evidence that they'd got beyond that, and it was really just what was there locally on the computer and on the desktop.
Ian, not only are you an award-winning journalist, but you're also a cyber author. So your latest book you've just come out with is 0 Days, which is really fantastic in the way it tells a fictional story, but it helps us to really understand some of the issues about deep cyber attacks and about the technology that's coming. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
When I came to write the book, I wanted to sort of, at the back of my mind was this idea that I wanted to demystify it, and I wanted to try and explain what were quite obtuse and very technical terms. And part of my thinking in writing the book was, yes, to have a bit of fun, to write a thriller, to have this cast of characters running around the world looking to try and find the creators of this cyber weapon, but also to use it as a vehicle to introduce all these myriad types of cyber threats and weapons, and to try and shed light on them, if you like, and make them a little bit more sort of comprehensible.
In 1992, you were one of the first journalists to uncover the Serbian detention camps. It won you an Emmy and a BAFTA award for the work that you did. If you had the technology that you have today, how much more quickly do you think you've been able to find what the Serbians were doing?
I think it would have been uncovered far sooner, because you have technologies ranging from Google Earth to satellite imagery. So you would have been able to find the locations of facilities, camps, which were holding people prisoner in that way. And I think the chances are that images, pictures, stories, anecdotes would have leaked out far quicker and far more effectively, because you have social media, you have all sorts of routes by which people can get information out. You do have access, and of course one example is if you look at the Chinese camps in Xinjiang, in which they've been incarcerating vast number of up to 1.5 million Uyghurs and other members of Muslim minorities. These were originally located through satellite imagery, through the study of these pictures, and also through procurement documents which were available on the internet, which hadn't been deleted or were archived.
You were there in Hong Kong and you were also in Beijing. Did you get a feeling of what was actually happening in terms of the surveillance and the cultural genocide that's been going on in the Xinjiang region?
Not as fast as it has. I mean, effectively, China is turning the internet into an intranet. They're putting an enormous wall around their cyberspace, trying to treat, I mean, Xi Jinping calls it cyber sovereignty. So he wants cyberspace to be as sealed and as impermeable as the physical borders of China.
Do you think that the Chinese government or other governments in future will crack down on being able to, for researchers to be able to access that technology?
They would like to control it, but there are limits to which they can. And it has become now a branch of journalism. They call it open source intelligence. And there are many ways in which you can use devices on search engines or satellite imagery or other methods to look through things which are out there.
Let's take you back to Russia in 2014. You were covering the Russian annexation of the Crimea. And at that point, we saw that the Russian government was monitoring Crimean internet activity, and it made it illegal to call for a succession of Crimea from Russia. Is this a tactic that's practiced throughout Russia? And is it something that we're seeing being continued?
Russia's very different from China in terms of the way they control the internet. China started out with the Great Firewall, as it was dubbed. I mean, the Great Firewall was always had holes in it. It was always a bit more like a Swiss cheese. But where Russia has excelled is in disinformation, misinformation, and trying to kind of control and manipulate the message that goes out within Russia and certainly beyond Russia's borders.
How do you think we should be protecting ourselves better? There's lots of elections coming up. We've got the American election this November. What do you think we should be doing to really focus on stopping foreign countries such as Russia from interfering in democratic process?
People are becoming more aware of it, so there is more skepticism. I like to think people are reading what comes their way more critically and looking more closely at the source and perhaps looking for verification elsewhere.
What advice would you give to young journalists, for example, perhaps going to China, or how to protect themselves better with this new technology?
The older generation to kind of put themselves out there. I think the message is that can come back to bite you. There are a lot of ways in which people can monitor what you've put out there. So you have to, I think, be much, much more wary. I think generally, particularly if you're working as a journalist or in the human rights field, that people will be looking to compromise you or to get access to your data, to the information that you have stored. And I think you need to at least take a lot of basic precautions against that. There's a sense in the West that cybersecurity is all about, the CIA, they call it, of computers. It's about protecting your computer systems and your networks. Confidentiality, integrity, availability are the three key words. But in China and other authoritarian regimes, when they talk about information security, they tend to see it in terms of controlling information, controlling the content of information and access to that information. There's a very different way of looking at it. And I think it came as no surprise that China has been the quickest and has gone furthest in adopting repressive surveillance technologies. When you look at what they've done in China, yes, it's absolutely chilling, the mass surveillance, the surveillance state, but it's also a warning of what happens when those technologies are used without oversight, without regulation, without debate, none of which, of course, takes place in China. And I think that's a warning to all of us here, because a lot of these technologies are increasingly being adopted in the UK with actually not very much debate at all.
What advice would you give to our government and other governments in trying to address this new world that we live in? Do we need an AI or a cyber czar?
I think we should, and I think we should talk about the issue of accountability of algorithms and the accountability of AI, because I think there's a tendency for these things to be adopted but by private industry or security, pushed through justification being necessity or commercial advantage or competitiveness or developing the AI economy because that's where we want to be at the forefront, without a discussion about what it means at a more human level and what it means at the level of rights, privacy, data protection. And you're seeing the embers of this, or the beginnings of this, with the EU, with a lot of initiatives in Scandinavia, Estonia, where there is a discussion over both data ownership, personal data ownership, and the accountability of algorithms, and that they have to demonstrate their neutrality or demonstrate a lack of harm before they can be adopted.
There's a lot of discussion in Europe around technologies and who owns what, and Chinese technology in particular. We've seen the debate on Huawei between the US and the UK, potentially disrupting our trade discussions. Do you think we have a good reason to be worried about Chinese technology companies?
The technology they produce, it's cheap and it's robust. But I think that we're missing the point in a lot of this discussion. Ultimately, it's about Chinese law, which obliges any Chinese company under national security laws, cybersecurity laws. Companies are obliged to cooperate with the party, with the state, in intelligence gathering and national security. They've got no choice. And it's not so much what the technology looks like now, it's what might happen further down the line. It's the potential for these companies to be used as an instrument of Chinese state policy.
And what are the worrying signs or the things that we should be looking out for across Europe?
In my view, coming back to the UK, we are just waking up to the reality of facial recognition and the fact that there are projects we saw King's Cross Station, we saw Westfield Shopping Mall in West London. We're seeing other places, other police pilot projects where facial recognition is being used, but without any discussion over what happens to that data, about the way it's being used, without any sort of oversight. And I think that you just got to look at China to see where that can lead if you don't have that oversight and that accountability. Britain's got an incredible density of surveillance cameras, but basically they're dumb cameras. They're cameras which, there may be some out here, there'll be an incident, the police will go and examine the footage and look for evidence from the footage. But what we're talking about in China and increasingly here is smart cameras, cameras which are powered by AI. Particularly face recognition. But the facial recognition is not only comparing what you see before you with a database, it's looking also at emotions, and it's also having the ability to look at factors within the face, which means that just because you're wearing a face mask doesn't necessarily mean that you can fool the camera, because there are other parameters they're looking at about expression, shapes of face. There are other ways, and in fact Hikvision itself has a camera which boasts the ability to look at 50 or 60 different parameters to be able to gauge the emotion of a person.
IOHR has just joined the Coalition to Stop Killer Robots, which we're really proud of. I love what they do, and they're really bringing attention of the world, not only of the UN and the EU, but the average individual actually understands what this is about, stopping weaponized drones, weaponized technologies from being removed from human intervention. You've written about this as well. What do you think we should be really standing up for?
I think it's potentially chilling. I mean, I know there are those who argue, well, if you have a drone used in warfare, you could also program it with the ethics of warfare, the rules of engagement, all sorts of other stuff. But I can't see armies voluntarily doing that. I mean, I think the problem is that you talk about autonomous drones, autonomous weapons. If you have a genuinely autonomous weapon with no human oversight, that becomes, I think, quite terrifying. And the debate over these weapons sometimes misses the point slightly, because where does the human dimension come into it? Where do you have the human ability to stop an operation, to prevent, to step in? Where is the degree of human oversight? Because I think the notion that you program a weapon, whether it's a drone or otherwise, to go away and do something and there's no recall is quite chilling. So where is the human element? Where is the human oversight in that?
The EU came out with a very good paper and a very strong statement this week talking about how to protect our data and our rights in a new technological world. Do you think that we should be really supporting and following that direction?
The EU has really been at the forefront of this. We've seen with the GDPR, the data protection and privacy provisions, which have really set a standard globally. They're now looking at AI, but I think the real danger at the moment, there's a lot of posturing over British negotiating position with the EU over the future relationship, but if Britain opts out of the data protection provisions of the EU, the implications of that, I think, for privacy, for data protection, for AI, for human rights, are quite profound, especially if we align ourselves with the United States, where the provisions are considerably less strict than they are in the EU.
Ian Williams, thank you so much for being with us today. It has been a fascinating journey, a global journey that you've taken us on in the world of cyber and AI, and I really look forward to reading your next book. Thank you. At IOHR, we want to continue this conversation about the impact of technology on human rights. There's a lot there between AI and cyber development and ethics and rights, and we hope that you'll join us to follow that journey. Thank you. Goodbye.